Sarah Mitchell ran into the surf without hesitation as a German shepherd surged ahead. The retired canine fought the waves, jaws locked on a stranger's jacket, keeping a lifeless teenage boy above water. Sarah dropped to the sand and began CPR, calm, precise, relentless. The crowd froze, phones rose, she saved his life. 3 days later, she lost everything. Fired for unauthorized intervention. The dog labeled unstable, protocol over people. What they didn't know was who that boy's father really was. Because when a senior commander in Washington heard the name Sarah Mitchell and saw that aging German shepherd, his blood ran cold. 15 years earlier, in a desert war zone, that same nurse and that same dog had become legends. And punishing them was the gravest mistake of all. Because heroes don't retire, and loyalty never forgets. The late afternoon wind rolled in hard from the Atlantic, bending the seagrass low along the dunes of the Outer Banks, North Carolina. The sky was a washed-out gray blue, the kind that made the horizon disappear, blurring ocean and air into one restless mass. By this hour, most tourists had already packed up. Umbrellas lay folded, towels flapped unattended. The beach felt wide, exposed, and strangely quiet, except for the waves, pounding with a rhythm that never softened. Sarah Mitchell walked alone near the waterline, boots sinking slightly into the damp sand. She was 38 years old, tall and lean, with the posture of someone who had learned long ago how to stand for hours without shifting her weight. Her brown hair was pulled into a low, practical knot at the base of her neck, streaked with early gray she didn't bother to hide. Her face carried sharp lines, not from age, but from discipline. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, eyes the color of storm clouds that rarely lingered on anyone for long. To strangers, Sarah seemed distant, polite, but guarded. The kind of woman who answered questions directly and never offered more than necessary. At the volunteer rescue station where she worked part-time, people described her as competent, quiet, and emotionally unavailable. They didn't know the reason for that distance. Sarah had once been a senior combat nurse in a military hospital overseas. She had learned, through blood, noise, and screaming, that caring too much could break you just as easily as caring too little. The habit of emotional restraint wasn't coldness, it was survival. Beside her walked Rex. The German shepherd moved with deliberate calm, his large frame steady against the wind. At 9 years old, he was past the prime of active service, but nothing about him looked fragile. His coat was thick and sable black, faded slightly around the muzzle with gray that marked his age. His ears stood upright, alert even at rest, and his eyes, deep brown, almost black, missed nothing. Rex had been a K9 once, a search and rescue dog, a protector, a partner. Now he wore no vest, no unit patch, no leash, though Sarah kept one looped loosely around her wrist out of habit more than necessity. He walked a half step ahead of her, not pulling, not lagging, just close enough to guard. People often mistook German shepherds for aggressive dogs. Rex wasn't aggressive. He was deliberate. His instincts ran deeper than commands, shaped by years of choosing lives over orders. Sarah trusted him more than she trusted most humans. They had found each other 2 years earlier, after both had been quietly removed from systems that no longer knew what to do with them. Sarah had left military service under a cloud of administrative notes and unspoken disapproval. Rex had been retired early after a classified incident no one wanted to discuss in detail. Neither of them talked about the past. The wind gusted harder, snapping at Sarah's jacket. She stopped walking. Rex stopped with her. Then he stiffened, his entire body locked, muscles tense beneath his fur. His ears pivoted sharply toward the open water, his head lowered just slightly, eyes narrowing, fixed on something beyond the breaking waves. "Rex," Sarah said quietly. He didn't look at her. Sarah followed his gaze. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just whitecaps and rolling water. Then she noticed movement that didn't match the rhythm of the sea. An arm, too still, a body drifting farther from shore, caught in the invisible pull of a rip current. A teenage boy. He was face up but unmoving, his limbs slack as the current dragged him sideways, away from safety. No splashing, no shouting, just the terrifying stillness that came when the body had already given up. "Oh no," Sarah breathed. She broke into a run. Rex moved first. Without waiting for a command, without even glancing back, he bolted. His paws tore through the wet sand as he surged into the water, chest hitting the waves with force. The cold shocked him, but he didn't hesitate. He swam hard, powerful strokes cutting through the surf. Sarah sprinted after him, boots abandoned halfway to the shoreline. She hit the water seconds later, breath knocked from her lungs as the current pulled against her legs. Rex reached the boy first. He circled once, assessing, then clamped his jaws carefully onto the collar of the teenager's jacket. Not tearing, not shaking, just enough to hold. With practiced strength, he angled his body against the current, keeping the boy's head above water as waves crashed over them both. Sarah reached them moments later. The boy was young, 17, maybe 18, pale, lips tinged blue. His chest didn't rise. "No pulse," she muttered, fingers already moving. Together, she and Rex fought their way back to shore. Rex didn't let go until Sarah had a firm grip, until gravity and sand replaced the ocean's pull. The boy collapsed onto the beach, water spilling from his mouth. Sarah dropped to her knees. She tilted his head back, cleared his airway, and placed her hands on his chest. Her movements were precise, automatic. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. Again, again. Around them, a small crowd gathered, beachgoers frozen in place, phones half raised, unsure whether to film or flee. Rex stood at Sarah's side, soaked and trembling, eyes never leaving the boy's face. As Sarah worked, memory intruded. A desert night, floodlights, a wounded soldier pinned beneath debris, someone shouting for her to pull back. Rex, then younger, stronger, planting himself over the man's body, refusing to move despite incoming fire. She remembered arguing with a commanding officer afterward. "He wouldn't leave him," she had said. "Neither would I." That refusal had followed her ever since. The boy on the sand coughed. Once. Then again. Violent, desperate gasps as his lungs dragged air back inside. Rolled to his side, retching seawater, hands clawing weakly at the sand. "He's breathing," Sarah said, relief threading through her voice, though her hands still shook. The crowd exhaled as one. Sirens sounded faintly in the distance. Sarah stayed with the boy, monitoring his breathing, speaking softly to keep him conscious until paramedics arrived. When they did, she delivered a concise report. Submersion time, CPR cycles, response. One of the medics glanced at Rex, then at Sarah. "That dog saved his life," he said quietly. Sarah nodded. "So did he," she replied, gesturing to the boy. As the ambulance pulled away, Rex finally relaxed, lowering himself onto the sand. His sides heaved, exhaustion setting in. Sarah crouched beside him, resting her forehead briefly against his. "You did good," she whispered. Rex looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. The storm clouds thickened overhead. Neither of them noticed the man standing farther up the beach, watching the ambulance disappear, his face pale, his hands clenched at his sides. Daniel Hayes was alive, and nothing would ever be the same again. The rain arrived overnight, driven in sideways sheets that rattled against the windows of the small rescue station near the dunes. Morning broke gray and heavy, the kind of coastal weather that pressed down on the chest and made every sound feel louder than it should. By the time Sarah Mitchell stepped inside the building, the events of the previous evening already felt distant, like something that had happened to another version of herself. Sarah moved with the same controlled economy she had learned years ago in military corridors and field hospitals. Tall and slim, shoulders squared, she wore plain jeans and a windbreaker, her hair pulled back tight. She greeted no one first, but nodded politely when spoken to. With co-workers, she was known as dependable but closed off, someone who never lingered in conversation. That distance had been forged by loss, patients she couldn't save, soldiers she had pronounced dead while shells fell close enough to shake the walls. Rex stayed close, to her left leg. The German shepherd's coat was still damp from the night air, dark fur clinging slightly along his spine. His movements were slower today, not from age alone, but from exhaustion. 9 years of service had taught him to remain alert even when tired, but his eyes carried a weariness Sarah recognized all too well. He scanned the room methodically, cataloging exits, assessing threats that weren't there. Inside the station, the atmosphere felt wrong. Lena Brooks, the senior coordinator, stood near the counter with her arms crossed. Lena was in her early 40s, broad-shouldered, sunburned from years on the coast. She had always treated Sarah with wary respect, impressed by her competence, but unsettled by how little she revealed. This morning, Lena avoided eye contact. "Sarah," she said finally, her voice flat, "the board wants to see you, now." Sarah didn't ask why. She already knew. The meeting room was small, functional, with salt-stained windows and folding chairs. 2 men sat inside, neither of whom Sarah recognized. One wore a county badge clipped to his belt. The other carried a leather folder thick with documents. The man with the folder introduced himself as Thomas Keene. Mid-50s, thinning hair, crisp polo shirt. His manner was professional, detached. The county official beside him, Officer Mark Ridley, was younger, late 30s, with a rigid posture and eyes that flicked toward Rex more often than Sarah. Keene didn't waste time. "Ms. Mitchell, we've reviewed yesterday's incident." Sarah stood straight, hands at her sides. "I provided emergency medical aid to a drowning victim." "While off duty," Keene replied, "without authorization, and while identifying yourself as a medical professional associated with this station." Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest. The same feeling she'd had years earlier when reports were read aloud in clipped voices that never matched the chaos she remembered. "He was unconscious," she said evenly. "He would have died." Ridley cleared his throat. "That's not in dispute. But procedure exists to protect institutions from liability." Sarah looked at him. "Procedure doesn't restart a heart." Keene sighed, as if disappointed. "Your contract with this station is terminated effective immediately. Violation of operational boundaries." The words landed with a dull thud. No shock, no anger, just confirmation. "And the dog," Ridley added, nodding toward Rex. "He acted without handler command. That makes him unstable." Rex's ears lifted slightly at the change in tone, but he remained still. "He saved a life," Sarah said. "He's a retired K-9, Ridley replied, which means federal oversight. There's a recommendation to transfer him for evaluation. If deemed unfit. He didn't finish the sentence. Sarah felt something colder than anger settle in her stomach. You're talking about euthanasia, she said. Keene closed his folder. We're talking about risk management. The meeting ended quickly after that. No ceremony, no acknowledgement of the life saved, just signatures and procedures. Sarah walked out carrying a single envelope, final paperwork, liability forms. Rex followed, his gait steady but alert, sensing the shift in her mood. Outside, the rain had slowed to a mist. She made it to the parking lot before stopping. Her hand rested on Rex's head, fingers pressing lightly into the thick fur between his ears. We're not done, she murmured. She wasn't sure who she was trying to convince. That afternoon, word spread faster than she expected. Lifeguards whispered. Volunteers avoided her gaze. By evening, a patrol vehicle appeared near her temporary rental on the edge of town. Inside the car sat Jack O'Neill. Jack stepped out slowly, hands visible, his movements careful. He was in his late 50s, tall but stooped slightly, with weathered skin and a gray beard trimmed short. His eyes were sharp, observant, the eyes of someone who had spent decades watching animals for signs others missed. I thought that was him, Jack said quietly, his gaze fixed on Rex. Rex froze, not in fear, in recognition. Jack crouched a few feet away, careful not to invade space. I'd know that stance anywhere, weight forward, head level. That's a combat-trained German Shepherd. Sarah studied him. And you are? Jack O'Neill, he replied. Former canine handler, Army, retired. He gestured gently toward Rex. He's older now, but that posture doesn't fade. Rex took one step forward, sniffed the air, then sat, calm but attentive. Jack nodded, almost to himself. Yeah, definitely worked overseas. Sarah's voice hardened. He's retired. Jack met her eyes. Retired dogs don't launch into rip currents unless something's very wrong. She hesitated. Then, they're saying he's unstable. Jack's jaw tightened. No, he's loyal. Big difference. He straightened slowly. I've seen this before. Dogs that don't abandon wounded soldiers get labeled problems. Easier than admitting command failure. Sarah felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt since the meeting ended. Not hope, recognition. They're threatening to take him, she said. Jack exhaled. Then you need to move fast. He explained in low tones about reassessments, about facilities that didn't rehabilitate but processed, about paperwork that erased service records with a stamp. Once they take him, Jack said, you won't get him back. Sarah looked down at Rex. His eyes met hers, steady, trusting. Years ago, a superior officer had told her she was too emotionally involved. That compassion clouded judgment. Standing there, she realized the truth. Compassion was the only thing that had ever made her judgment clear. Night fell early under the thick clouds. Sarah packed, quietly. Jack helped without asking questions, his movements efficient. When he left, he clasped her shoulder once, firmly. He's a good dog, Jack said. They always are. Sarah didn't correct him. Rex climbed into the back of her car and settled in, resting his head against the seat. As they pulled away from the coast, Sarah glanced in the rearview mirror. The lights of the rescue station faded into darkness. 2 lives saved, 2 lives discarded. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel. They were done following orders. The television in the hospital family lounge was muted, captions crawling along the bottom of the screen while the morning news looped endlessly. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee. Colonel James Hayes sat alone in a straight-backed chair, his hands folded neatly in his lap, posture rigid from habit rather than comfort. At 56, he carried himself like a man who had spent most of his life standing at attention. Tall, broad-shouldered, hair cut short and graying at the temples. His face was deeply lined, not from age, but from years of restraint. James Hayes was a man who believed emotion should be controlled, rationed, released only when necessary. On the screen, a shaky phone video played for the third time. A beach, gray skies, a woman kneeling in wet sand, and beside her, James leaned forward. The German Shepherd filled the frame for a brief second, water dripping from his coat, body angled protectively toward the boy on the ground. The footage, blurred, but not enough to hide the dog's stance. Weight forward, head low, eyes locked. James felt the air leave his lungs. He had seen that posture before, not on a beach, not in daylight, but under floodlights in a foreign desert, with smoke in the air and the sound of distant gunfire cutting through the night. He remembered the way that dog had planted himself over a wounded Marine, refusing to move even as debris fell around them, the way his eyes had never left the threat. The reporter's voice cut through the memory. Authorities are now reviewing the conduct of a former military nurse and a retired K-9 involved in yesterday's rescue. James turned up the volume. Questions have been raised about unauthorized intervention and animal control violations. His jaw tightened. The camera shifted to a still image of the dog, older now, grayer around the muzzle, but unmistakable. The name appeared beneath the photo. Rex. James closed his eyes. He hadn't known the dog's name back then. In the chaos of that night, names had been the least important thing. But he remembered the feel of sand under his gloves as he crawled toward the blast site. He remembered shouting for the K-9 unit to pull back. He remembered being ignored, and he remembered living because of it. The door to the lounge opened quietly. "Dad?" Daniel Hayes stood hesitantly just inside the doorway. At 18, Daniel was tall but still boyish, his dark hair falling into his eyes, his face pale from the night in the ICU. He moved carefully, one hand resting on the doorframe, still weak but stubbornly upright. He had inherited his father's height, but none of his hardness. Daniel was open in ways James had never allowed himself to be. James stood immediately. "You shouldn't be up," Daniel smiled faintly. "Doctor says I'm not made of glass." James placed a steadying hand on his son's shoulder, guiding him to the chair. Only once Daniel was seated did James allow himself to sit again. They watched the screen in silence as the clip replayed. "That dog," Daniel said softly. "He didn't leave me." James nodded. "He wouldn't." Daniel turned, surprised. "You know him?" James hesitated. He hadn't planned to tell this story. He had spent years burying it under reports and commendations that never told the truth. But looking at his son, alive, breathing, he realized the story had already returned, whether he wanted it to or not. "I served with a dog like him," James said finally. "A long time ago." Daniel frowned slightly. "Like him how?" "Same breed, same eyes." James paused. "Same refusal to abandon people." The reporter moved on to a different segment, but James barely noticed. His mind had already gone elsewhere. That afternoon, James sat alone in his office at the base, the door closed, the blinds drawn. The room was orderly to the point of severity. Framed commendations lined the wall, each one earned, each one representing decisions that had cost lives as often as they had saved them. He opened his laptop and typed a single name into the secure database. Rex. The file loaded slowly. Service history, redacted sections, early retirement, behavioral non-compliance noted, incident reports flagged and buried. James scrolled, his expression darkening with each line. There it was, a disciplinary report from years earlier. A K-9 refused to withdraw during an active operation. Handler overruled command. Medical officer intervened to protect the animal during after-action review. Name listed under medical personnel present, Sarah Mitchell. James stared at the name. The memory hit him hard and sudden. A young woman in blood-stained fatigues, kneeling in the dirt beside the dog. Hands steady despite the chaos. Her hair pulled back tight, her face set in grim focus as she worked to stop the bleeding along the dog's flank. He remembered her voice, calm, unyielding, as she argued with an officer twice her rank. "He stays," she had said. "If you punish him, you punish me." At the time, James had been a lieutenant colonel, buried under responsibilities, choosing which fires to put out and which to let burn. He had signed off on the report without reading it closely. He had told himself it was just paperwork. Now he saw the cost of that indifference. He opened a second file, Sarah Mitchell. The record was thin, too thin for someone who had served as long as she had. Transfers, reassignments, a quiet departure from military service under ambiguous circumstances. James leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. Outside, rain began to fall again, tapping softly against the glass. Across town, Sarah sat in her car at a rest stop, Rex asleep in the back seat. The lines of her face were drawn tighter than usual, exhaustion settling into her bones. She replayed the morning's meeting in her head, every word dissected, every implication weighed. She had always known this day might come. She had never expected it to hurt this much. Rex shifted, his breathing uneven, paws twitching as if chasing something in his sleep. She reached back, resting her fingers lightly against his shoulder. The scars beneath his fur told their own story. Shrapnel, fire, the price of loyalty. Another memory surfaced unbidden. Explosions, dust, the dog throwing himself over a Marine just as the secondary blast hit. Sarah remembered screaming for him to move, then realizing he wouldn't. She remembered tearing open a medical kit with shaking hands, pressing gauze against torn flesh while bullets cracked overhead. She had been called insubordinate for that too. Back at the base, James closed the files and sat very still. He understood now what had happened on that beach. His son had not been saved by chance. He had been saved by two warriors the system had already decided it was done with. James picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "I need everything you have on a former nurse named Sarah Mitchell," he said when the line connected. "And I need to know where she is, now." He ended the call and stared at the darkened screen. Outside his office, the base continued its routines, unaware that a line long buried had just been crossed. James Hayes had commanded men in combat. He had sent them into danger, knowing some would not return. He had learned to live with that weight. But this was different, because this time, the people being punished were the ones who had refused to leave anyone behind. And that was a debt he could no longer ignore. Colonel James Hayes closed the door to his office and locked it, a small, deliberate act that marked the shift from routine to resolve. The room was quiet except for the low hum of the air system and the distant cadence of boots on concrete outside. He set his cap on the desk, loosened his collar, and opened the secure files he had pulled the night before. He did not rush. Hayes had learned, over decades of command, that speed without clarity was just noise. The first file bore the dog's name in stark lettering: Rex, K9, German Shepherd. The photograph was old, taken when the dog was younger, coat darker, eyes brighter. Hayes studied the eyes. He had never forgotten them. They were not wild or aggressive. They were focused, disciplined, and unyielding in a way that mirrored the best soldiers he had commanded. Below the image, annotations ran long and cold: non-compliance noted, handler override, early retirement recommended. Hayes scrolled, jaw tightening. He opened the incident. Report from years earlier, the one he had skimmed and signed without reading closely. This time, he read every line. He saw how the language shifted responsibility, how a decision made under fire became failure to follow directive, how a dog's refusal to abandon a wounded Marine was recast as instability, how a nurse's insistence on treatment was reframed as emotional interference. He leaned back and exhaled through his nose. He had been part of this machine long enough to recognize its patterns. When leadership failed, paperwork learned how to lie. Hayes opened the second file: Sarah Mitchell, medical, former. The photo showed a tall, lean woman with squared shoulders and eyes that did not seek approval. Even in a still image, there was something unyielding about her posture, as if she had learned to brace herself against the world rather than ask it to be gentle. Her service record told a story in omissions: commendations that stopped abruptly, transfers that made no sense, a quiet exit framed as mutual agreement. He cross-referenced timelines, names, signatures, patterns emerged, orders issued late, communications logged after the fact, after-action reviews edited by hands that never touched blood. Hayes felt a familiar, unwelcome heat build behind his eyes, not rage, but something colder. Accountability deferred long enough becomes complicity. He opened a third file, one he had requested only hours earlier, a compilation of similar cases. K9 units reassigned after behavioral concerns, medics disciplined for scope violations. Always the same result, always the same silence. Hayes closed the files and sat very still. He knew what came next, and he knew the cost. Across the state, Sarah Mitchell drove inland as dawn lifted the fog from the marshes. She had slept in short bursts, waking to the sound of wreck shifting in the back seat. The German Shepherd lay curled on a blanket, ribs rising and falling unevenly. At 9 years old, his body carried the weight of years of service. But it was his mind that worried her. His eyes flicked open at every passing headlight. His ears twitched at distant noises that meant nothing. PTSD, she thought, without clinical detachment. She had seen it in men and women. She had lived with it herself. Sarah was a woman who moved through the world carefully. Tall, slim, her movements economical, she had learned to make herself small without ever appearing weak. She spoke plainly, avoided crowds, and trusted actions over words. What had shaped her was not one event, but an accumulation. Too many nights where she had chosen who would live because resources were finite and time was not kind. She pulled into a quiet roadside park as the sun broke through. The place was empty. She let Rex out and watched him pace the perimeter, nose low, eyes scanning the tree line. He did not wander. He patrolled. "Easy," she said softly. Rex paused, then sat. His breathing was shallow. He hadn't slept through the night. When she reached for him, he flinched once, barely, but enough Sarah's chest tightened. She knelt, placing a hand against his shoulder, grounding him with pressure, not restraint. "You're safe," she murmured. She did not say it loudly. Safety had to be believable to matter. He leaned into her touch, trembling, subsiding inch by inch. She remembered the first time she had seen him bleed, the metallic smell, the way he had tried to stand despite the damage, the way Command had spoken about assets while she pressed gauze into torn muscle with hands that would not stop shaking. "You're not an asset," she whispered now. "You're my partner." Back at the base, Hayes made his first call, then his second. He spoke carefully, choosing words that opened doors rather than slammed them. He did not accuse. He asked questions. He did not demand. He requested documentation. He invoked oversight, not outrage. The system listened when spoken, too, in its own language. By midday, his office filled with quiet activity. Aides came and went, files stacked, screens glowed with timelines and annotations. Hayes watched the evidence align, each piece reinforcing the last. This was not one bad decision. It was a practice. He drafted a memorandum, not to punish, but to review, not to indict, but to clarify. The language was precise, surgical. He named no villains. He let the facts do the work. When he finished, he sat back and considered the next step. Restoration of honor was not a speech. It was a process. He thought of his son, alive because a dog and a nurse had refused to obey the wrong order. He thought of the debt. Sarah spent the afternoon tending to Rex in small, patient ways. She found a quiet motel near the highway and asked for a ground-floor room away from the ice machine. She dimmed the lights. She laid out his blanket just so. When he paced, she let him. When he froze at a sudden noise, she waited until his breathing slowed. She fed him by hand when he refused the bowl. "Eat," she said gently. One bite, he took it, then another. She did not scold him for the growl he couldn't suppress when a truck backfired outside. She did not restrain him when his muscles tensed. She placed herself between him and the window, a familiar formation. As night fell, Rex finally lay down, head on his paws, eyes open. Sarah sat beside him, back against the wall, the way she had once sat against a sandbagged barrier while mortar rounds fell in the distance. She stayed awake until his breathing deepened. In the quiet, her phone buzzed once. A missed call from an unknown number. She did not return it. Back in his office, Hayes read a final document that arrived encrypted and late. It confirmed what he already knew, signatures that didn't match timelines, edits made after the fact, authority used to erase responsibility. He closed his eyes. Instinct is not a crime, he thought. It is the first language of survival. He opened a new document and began outlining a campaign, not public, not loud, but thorough, a restoration process that would return names to records and truth to reports. He would not rush it. Rushed justice breaks as easily as delayed justice. He looked again at Rex's photograph, then at Sarah's. "Not forgotten," he said quietly. Outside, the rain returned, steady and unremarkable. Systems moved, people slept. Somewhere on a dark highway, a woman sat watch beside an old dog who had never learned how to abandon a life. And for the first time in a long while, the machine had begun to turn the right way. The coastal K9 base sat low against the dunes, concrete and steel softened by salt air and wind. Morning light spilled across the parade ground in pale bands, the ocean just visible beyond the fence, restless but calm. It was not a grand installation, no towering flagpoles or marble halls, just a working place for working animals and the people who understood them. That was why Colonel James Hayes had chosen it. Hayes stood near the edge of the formation, hands clasped behind his back, uniform immaculate. In daylight, he looked exactly as command expected him to look, tall, composed, ironed sharp at the seams. But there was a quiet urgency in his eyes, the kind that came when a man had decided something would be set right, no matter how long it took. Around him, a small audience gathered, handlers in plain fatigues, medical staff, a few officers whose names would never appear in headlines. No cameras, no speeches written to impress, just witnesses. Sarah Mitchell waited with Rex a short distance away. She wore a simple dark jacket over a pressed shirt, her hair pulled back as always. Tall and slender, she stood straight without stiffness, hands resting lightly at her sides. The years had shaped her into someone reserved with strangers, but there was a steadiness about her now that had not been there when she left the coast. The weight she carried had not vanished, it had shifted. Caring for Rex through the nights, counting his breaths, steadying him through startled awakenings, had given her something to hold on to again, purpose, even if she did not yet know what shape it would take. Rex stood at her left, his coat brushed until it shone, gray at the muzzle, catching the light. At 9 years old, he moved more slowly than he once had, but his posture remained unmistakable. Ears forward, chest lifted, a working dog's stance, even without a vest. His eyes scanned the gathering with careful attention, noting each new presence, each unfamiliar scent. Other dogs stood nearby, German shepherds, all of them, some younger, restless with energy, others older, their movements measured, their faces marked by the same silver that traced Rex's. Each had a handler or caretaker close by, retired K9s, many of them, dogs who had served, then been set aside when their usefulness was deemed complete. Today they stood together, a quiet assembly of veterans. Daniel Hayes arrived last. He walked carefully across the ground, still thin from his hospital stay, but moving with determination. At 18, he carried the soft edges of youth, but there was something new in the way he held himself, an awareness that life could be taken without warning, and that being alive was not guaranteed. He wore a plain jacket and jeans, nothing formal, his hands tucked into his pockets as if unsure where they belonged. When he saw Sarah, his face lit with recognition and relief. She offered a small nod. Daniel returned it, then glanced down at Rex. "That's him," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. "You stayed." Rex looked at him, head tilting just slightly, then turned his gaze forward again. Daniel smiled anyway. The ceremony began without fanfare. Colonel Hayes stepped forward. His voice carried easily across the open space, measured and calm. He did not dramatize. He did not soften the truth. "Today," he said, "we recognize service that was overlooked, not because it was insignificant, but because it was inconvenient." He spoke of duty, not as obedience, but as responsibility. He spoke of instinct, not as a flaw, but as a form of knowledge earned under pressure. He did not name failures. He named facts. When he turned toward Rex, a handler approached carrying a small case. Inside lay the German Shepherd Service Medal, its ribbon simple, its meaning anything but. Rex was led forward. The dog stepped with confidence, nails clicking softly against the ground. He did not pull. He did not hesitate. He stopped exactly where Sarah stopped, both of them aligned as if by habit. Hayes knelt. For a moment, the rank dissolved. There was just a man and a dog. This medal, Hayes said quietly, recognizes courage under conditions where retreat would have been easier. He attached the ribbon to Rex's collar. The medal caught the light. Rex did not react. He stood, breathing steady, eyes fixed ahead. Behind them, several handlers snapped to attention without being instructed. A ripple of respect passed through the group. Hayes rose and turned to Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying again, "your service record has been amended. The actions for which you were disciplined have been reviewed and corrected. On behalf of this command and those who failed you, I offer a formal apology." Sarah did not move at first. The words settled slowly, as if she had to test their weight before accepting them. Apologies had been rare in her career. When they came at all, they were usually quiet, conditional. This one was neither. She nodded once. "Thank you, sir." It was all she said. It was enough. Daniel stepped forward then, breaking the formality in a way no one objected to. He stood awkwardly at first, hands fidgeting, then straightened, meeting Sarah's eyes. "I don't remember everything," he said, his voice unsteady but clear. "I remember water, and then I remember waking up and seeing you, and him." He glanced at Rex, swallowing. "You didn't know who I was," Daniel continued. "You didn't owe me anything, but you ran in anyway, both of you." He paused, then added simply, "Thank you for giving me another chance." Sarah felt her throat tighten. She placed a hand on Rex's back, grounding herself in the familiar warmth. "You're welcome," she said softly. As the small crowd dispersed, handlers introduced their dogs to one another, quiet conversations blooming where silence had been. A few of the older shepherds lay down together, bodies touching, as if reassured by shared presence. These dogs did not play. They rested. That, too, was a kind of trust. Later, in a modest office overlooking the kennels, Hayes met with Sarah privately. The room was plain. Metal desk, 2 chairs, a window that rattled slightly in the breeze. Hayes removed his cap and set it aside, the gesture informal. "There's something else," he said. "An opportunity." Sarah listened without interrupting. "We're seeing more cases like Rex," Hayes continued. "Dogs retired with no support, handlers struggling to help them reintegrate. The system treats them like equipment. We need something better." He slid a folder across the desk. "A program," he said, "focused on psychological care and reintegration for retired German Shepherd K9s, training for handlers, support for caregivers. We want you to help build it." Sarah looked down at the folder, then back up. Her expression remained guarded, but curiosity flickered beneath it. "I'm not a policymaker," she said. "No," Hayes agreed. "You're a nurse who understands trauma, and a partner who understands loyalty." She thought of Rex pacing in the night, of the way his breathing steadied when she stayed close, of the dogs she had seen discarded because their wounds were invisible. "I'll consider it," she said. Hayes nodded. "That's all I ask." When Sarah and Rex left the base, the sun was higher, the air warmer. Rex moved with a subtle lightness that had not been there before, metal resting against his chest. He paused at the gate and looked back once, ears flicking toward the kennels where other shepherds watched. Sarah followed his gaze. "We're not done," she murmured, echoing words she had spoken days earlier with far less certainty. Rex stepped forward. Behind them, the ocean rolled on, indifferent and endless. But on the shore, something had shifted. Honor, once denied, had been spoken aloud. And for the first time since the waves had closed over a young man's head, Sarah felt the long tension in her chest begin, just a little, to ease. The center opened on a clear morning, the air crisp with salt and pine. It sat just inland from the coast, low buildings arranged around a wide training field, kennels set back beneath shade structures, classrooms facing the wind. There were no banners, no grand signage, only a modest plaque at the gate that read German Shepherd K9 Recovery and Civilian Rescue Training Center. Sarah Mitchell stood there for a long moment before stepping inside. Tall and lean as she had always been, shoulders squared by habit, eyes steady with a calm that had taken years to earn. Sarah was 40 now, her hair still pulled back in a simple knot, gray threading through brown she no longer bothered to dye. Time had refined her rather than softened her. She spoke plainly, listened carefully, and carried herself with a quiet authority that came not from rank but from experience. What had shaped her most was not the ceremony or the apology. It was the nights after, sitting on the floor with an old dog, learning how to help him sleep. Rex walked beside her. The German Shepherd moved slower these days, hips stiff in the mornings, muzzle pale with silver. At 10 years old, he no longer scanned every corner with urgency. His ears still lifted at sudden sounds, but the tension drained more quickly now, the panic fading before it could take hold. A blue collar rested against his chest, no medal, no ribbon, just his name stitched in white. He was not a tool anymore. He was home. The staff gathered as Sarah crossed the yard. There were trainers in plain fatigues, medical instructors in soft-soled shoes, volunteers in practical clothes. Some were former handlers, others civilian medics. A few had come from far away after hearing about a place that treated retired K9s as partners rather than liabilities. Sarah nodded to them, greeting each by name. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. In the kennels, other German shepherds stirred. Some were young and energetic, tails thumping against chain link. Others were older, lying quietly, eyes tracking movement with measured interest. These were dogs who had served, bomb detection, search and rescue, patrol, and then struggled when the work ended. Here, they learned to rest without fear. Sarah moved through the space with purpose. She checked schedules, spoke briefly with a trainer about a scent exercise, paused to listen as a volunteer described progress with an anxious dog who startled at doors. When she placed a hand on Rex's back, it was absent-minded and affectionate, the touch of someone who had learned that presence could be as powerful as command. Later that morning, a group of civilian trainees assembled near the field. They were firefighters, EMTs, coastal rescue volunteers, people who would carry these lessons beyond the gates. Sarah stood before them, posture relaxed but attentive. "We don't teach aggression here," she said. "We teach discernment, instinct, recovery. A dog who can't rest, can't work. A handler who doesn't listen, can't lead." Rex lay at her feet, head on his paws, eyes half closed. When she spoke, his ears twitched. When she stopped, he settled again. Across the field, Daniel Hayes watched. Daniel was 19 now, broader through the shoulders, his posture straighter than it had been months earlier. He wore a simple hoodie and jeans, a backpack slung over one shoulder. The softness of youth remained, but there was focus in his eyes, the kind that came from knowing how easily life could slip away. He had enrolled in an emergency medicine program the previous fall, drawn by a certainty that had taken hold on a gray beach when he learned how it felt to be pulled back from the edge. He waited until the session ended, then approached Sarah. "Director Mitchell," he said, smiling. He still sounded unsure of the title. She smiled back, small but genuine. Daniel. He knelt beside Rex, letting the dog sniff his hand before scratching gently, behind one ear. Rex leaned into it, content. I passed my first clinical rotation, Daniel said. Trauma response. It's hard, but it feels right. Sarah nodded. It should. They stood together for a moment, watching a trainer guide a shepherd through a calm-down exercise. Slow steps, controlled breathing, reward for stillness. Progress measured not in speed, but in trust. I wanted to thank you, Daniel said. Again, for all of this. Sarah glanced at Rex. He started it. Daniel shook his head. You finished it. In the afternoon, Sarah met with the board briefly. There were reports to review, rescues completed, dogs rehabilitated, trainees certified. The numbers were steady and climbing. More important than the metrics were the outcomes. Dogs sleeping through the night, handlers learning to slow down, civilians trained to work with animals rather than against them. When the meeting ended, Sarah declined the offer of a car. She preferred to walk. At the edge of the property, she stopped at a small fenced area set apart from the others. Inside, an elderly German shepherd lay in the sun, eyes closed, chest rising evenly. A volunteer sat nearby, reading softly. This dog had arrived months earlier, withdrawn and shaking. Now, he slept. Rex watched from beside Sarah, tail swaying once. That's what we're here for, she murmured. As the day cooled, Sarah locked the office and headed home, a modest house a short drive away, porch light already on. Rex climbed the steps slowly, then settled inside with a satisfied sigh. Sarah filled his bowl, then her own glass, the simple rituals grounding her in a life she had once thought unreachable. She sat on the floor beside him as evening fell, back against the couch, Rex's head resting on her thigh. The house was quiet, no alarms, no radios, just the sound of breathing. She thought of the past, not with regret, but with clarity. The nights in field hospitals, the reports written by people who had not been there, the labels that had followed her out the door. All of it had led here in ways she could not have planned. Rex shifted, letting out a low, contented sound. You did good, she said, the words familiar now, unburdened by urgency. Months later, the center expanded. More dogs arrived. More lives were steadied. Some animals returned to limited service. Others retired into families prepared to understand them. Rex became something like a constant, present at orientations, dozing near the field, rising when needed, a calm anchor for dogs and people alike. He aged gracefully. His steps shortened. His naps lengthened. But his presence never diminished. On a quiet evening near the end of summer, Sarah sat with him on the porch as the sky darkened to indigo. The wind carried the distant sound of the ocean. Rex rested his head against her knee, eyes reflecting the porch light. You don't have to stand watch tonight, she whispered. He didn't move. He never had. She smiled, resting her hand against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm beneath her palm. For a long time, they sat that way, woman and dog, no orders given, none required. Inside the house, a framed photograph hung on the wall. A beach under gray skies, a woman kneeling in the sand, a German shepherd standing guard. Not a moment of heroism frozen in time, but the beginning of something quieter and far more lasting. Outside, the world turned on, and at the threshold between past and future, the last watch was kept, not by command, but by choice. German shepherds don't need orders to protect, Sarah said softly into the night. and the ones who understand that never leave them behind. This story is not really about a dog or a nurse or even a rescue on a beach. It is about something much closer to our daily lives. In the world we live in, we are often taught to follow rules first and ask questions later. We are told to stay in our lane, protect ourselves, and avoid trouble. But sometimes the right thing to do does not come with permission. Sometimes doing what is right costs us comfort, reputation, or security. Sarah did not run into the water because she was brave. Rex did not protect because he was ordered to. They acted because helping someone in danger felt more important than protecting themselves. In everyday life, we face smaller versions of the same choice. Speaking up when someone is treated unfairly. Helping a stranger even when it is inconvenient. Standing by someone who is struggling instead of looking away. These moments rarely look heroic. Most of the time, no one is watching, but they matter more than we realize. This story also reminds us that those who carry the deepest wounds are often the ones who protect others the most. People and animals who have suffered are not broken. They are often the most compassionate, the most loyal, the most willing to stand watch when everyone else walks away. If this story touched you, let it be a quiet reminder in your own life. Choose kindness when it would be easier to stay silent. Choose courage when it would be safer to step back. Choose loyalty to what is right, even when there is no reward. If you believe that doing the right thing still matters in this world, share this story with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us what this story meant to you. Subscribe to the channel if you believe stories like this deserve to be told. And if you believe, take a moment now and ask God to watch over everyone reading this. May God protect those who help others. May He heal those who carry unseen wounds. May He guide us to act with compassion when it matters most. If you want to say that prayer together, type Amen in the comments.